Which firms were most resilient when Covid-19 devastated their economies? New research highlights the value of digital technologies such as online sales. So, during the pandemic, what were the returns to tech sophistication? Hello again, Diego.
Hi, how are you, Tim?
Good, thanks. Now, Diego, we use technology in economics to mean all sorts of different things at different times. In this work that we're talking about today, this research that you've done, what technology are we specifically talking about?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Technology is something that is a very generic idea in economics, and so we often don't are not very precise and not very sophisticated in what we mean by technology. So this work builds on earlier work we have done, where we have tried to be extremely rich in our conceptualization of technology. Um, so to give a long answer to a short question, what we have tried is to first, we have worked into stages. Okay, we have first thought about um, what are the key business functions that companies undertake, and second, what are the different technological options that they have to undertake the key tasks associated to those business functions. Okay, suppose that you are talking about business administration. Okay, so you could run a company just with pencil and paper, handwritten processes, all the way to using a sophisticated ERP system that integrates all sorts of tasks in the firm. Okay, our idea is that technology is not just a tool, a machine, a software, but is something that we want to measure in association with how it is used in the company. Okay, and so that's why we have these two-dimensional metrics that reflects not just the sophistication of the tools used to do something, but also where these tools are applied. Okay, and so going back to this paper, what we have done is we have divided technologies in this survey into those that are common across firms, like there are business functions that all the firms, regardless of the sector, regardless of the country where they operate, they are going to be utilizing, and others that are sector specific. So in this paper, we focus on general business functions that are basically, let me list them for you. Administration, um, operations planning, sourcing and procurement, marketing, sales, payment methods, and quality control. And so we have focused on technology associated with how these 7 key general business functions are conducted. And so at the end, what you end up is with a grid that has approximately uh, between 35 and 40 potential technologies that you could utilize to conduct collectively each of these 7 business functions, which go from the most basic to the most sophisticated. Okay, so they cover the full spectrum, and so you have like a very rich set of data that characterizes uh, the technology that firms utilize to conduct these general business functions. And what we do is for each of them we have a sophistication index that tells you, of all the possible business functions that you could use, which is the one that you are using most in your company, and that determines the index that you have in that business function. And then we compute a simple average of those. That's the measure of technology that we record in the paper.
And you're looking at how these technologies deliver resilience during the pandemic. I think I've got a clue what the answer might be, but why might these technologies be particularly relevant during COVID-19?
Yes. So two reasons. Okay. One is at a general level, our idea is that first, there was some, casual evidence indicates that there was some technological transformations in companies during COVID, okay, and that this technological transformation presumably help cope with the challenges of operating in a pandemic in a pandemic. No? So there are two channels in which technologies could affect resilience, by which we mean, keeping sales as close as possible to pre-pandemic levels. One is that, in general, having access to more sophisticated technologies typically in general business functions is associated to operating more digitally, which requires uh, less physical interactions, which is good which was important in the pandemic. Okay, so just the initial level, of sophistication of the technologies could have a direct effect on resilience. Okay, but in addition, there is a second possibility why being sophisticated technologically in using these general business in your operation of general business functions may be relevant, which is that presumably, it could be the case, it has been documented in other instances that by having a greater pre-pandemic technological level, you are more ready to further implement digital technologies that are going to be relevant during COVID. Okay, so there is both a direct channel on sales and an indirect channels through the further adoption of digital technologies. This is why, we think that having this information about the technological level of firms before COVID is potentially relevant to understand how firms cope later with COVID.
How many firms, what selection of firms were you able to analyze? Because to do this, you have to use firm level data, clearly, and that's pretty hard to find, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is. I mean, we were in the right place at the right time, I would say. Like, basically, um, 5 years ago, we started working on putting together comprehensive data sets of representative samples of firms for different countries in the world. Uh, that was, way before COVID. And in 2019, we managed to collect data for the first three countries that in our list of countries. Okay, these were data in Senegal, in Vietnam, and in one state in Brazil, in Ceará. Um, so this data, it covered like around 4,000 firms in these three locations. That were representative in each of the locations. Okay, so we can draw aggregate inferences for the country, for the sector, for different types of firms, um, and that's the data that we utilize. Now, when COVID struck, we had all this information about how firms were before COVID. Um, there was an interest in seeing how they were coping with COVID, and so what we did was to do a second survey uh, in the around June of 2020, between, like, I would say, between April and June of 2020, where we came back to the companies and asked them basically first whether they had changed their technologies, whether they had upgraded certain digital technologies, and second, by how much had their sales declined since the previous year. And so that gave us sufficient information together with all the information we had about these firms, to conduct this analysis.
So many things go into deciding the competitiveness of firms, though, that you'd have to control for, though, Diego. Were you able to capture really hard to measure things like the quality of management of a firm?
Yes, that's obviously the key concern that one has, is that basically what you are finding is not related directly to technology, but is related to something else that you are not controlling for, and that something else is what is driving the resilience of the firm or even the upgrade of technologies. Of course, that's the big elephant in the room that we need to shoot somehow. So the main tool that we had, as you suggest, to cope with this challenge, is all the information that we have about this firm. So in our survey, we were very careful to collect lots of information on management practices, which is, based on the work by Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen. So we have, version of their C scores on management practices, but we have additionally lots of information on the managers themselves, like, for example, their experience, whether they have studied abroad, whether they have been managing multinationals. We have lots of information on the human capital of the workers. We know how many workers are working are college educated. We know we have information about the wage per worker. We have, which suggests something also about human capital. So we have lots of controls for firm characteristics before the pandemic, and what we find is that those are not conflicting with our estimated effects. So it's not just that they don't change the coefficients, but they don't matter too much for the results that we're finding.
So, what is the result that you're finding here? What is the effect of the adoption of these digital technologies on the resilience, on the sales during COVID-19?
Yeah, so what we find in a nutshell is that the pre-pandemic readiness of companies, their technological sophistication before COVID, um, it's it's important, has an important effect on keeping sales close to the pre-pandemic levels. Um, an increase by one standard deviation in the pre-pandemic technology level, it's associated to about 6.6 percentage points higher sales during the pandemic. And then, decomposing this effect between these two channels that I've discussed, what we find is that the pre-pandemic technological level um, affects the probability that the firm is going to improve its digital capabilities during the recession, during the pandemic, quite significantly. So if you take a firm, you compare the probability of upgrading the digital capabilities, the digital technologies of a firm during the pandemic. You compare a firm that is in the bottom 20% of technological readiness and the top 20%. In the probability of upgrading digital capabilities varies by 37%, basically. So there is a very significant effect, very significant association between where the firm was before the pandemic and the probability that they improve the digital capabilities. However, this effect um, only accounts for a small fraction, for around 20% of this big effect that we have seen of pre-pandemic technologies on resilience. Okay, so the majority of this effect has to do with the direct effect, not on the is not related to this indirect effect that operates through the improvement of digital capabilities of the firms during the pandemic.
Yeah, I was very interested that you covered this improvement of technology during the pandemic. I spoke at the outset of the pandemic to a lot of firms, and the thing that I heard over and over again, anecdotally, is that they had to compress 5 years of this digital transition, as we call it, into about 6 months. Does your research give you any insights into which type of firms were best able to accomplish this?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the key things that we observe is that those that were already relatively sophisticated were the ones that were more likely to further improve their technological sophistication, their the digital technologies, digital um, 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 operations. So yes, there was massive adoption of new technologies, but it was relatively asymmetric. There were some that stayed behind, and those were the ones that were really like already behind to begin with. So
Is this advantage now effectively baked in, or is it just about resilience in a crisis?
well, I think it's both. Like, if you are more sophisticated, that's going to be good for your performance throughout. I mean, we are finding that normal times, having a more sophisticated technological basis, it's going to be associated with higher productivity, higher profits. A variety of good things happen to firms that are more sophisticated. But also, when a crisis comes like this one, where there is a significant premium to operating digitally, then obviously, the value, the return on the homework that you did before is huge.
Is what you're investigating here about creative destruction, about finding the winners and the losers in one country or one region? Or is there a lesson here for governments that they should be incentivizing in general all of their firms to adopt these digital technologies, make that digital transition?
That's a great question. We are not taking a strong stand of what nature are the costs of adopting the technologies. Clearly, they are costs because otherwise everybody would adopt them, given that there is huge advantages from using them. Okay, so we're documenting the benefits of it. So if you don't do it, it's because either you are not very good manager or it's very difficult for you to implement it. Subsequent research needs to identify these costs. I mean, these costs probably don't have to do with the price of the technology, given the magnitude of the benefits. They will have to do with the difficulty of certain firms to implement those technologies, not the pure monetary cost of acquiring the technologies. One thing that we are seeing too is that the benefit of using the technology, it's also greater in firms that are more sophisticated. Okay, so one thing that happens here is that we are putting all the emphasis on the cost of implementing the technology, but it could be the case that for certain firms it's just not worth it. Okay, maybe the pandemic is a bit extreme. Okay, and so maybe in the pandemic everybody would have benefited from being more digital, but in normal times it could be the case that certain firms don't benefit much from implementing certain technologies because they are unsophisticated technologically, and that's their space. And what happens is that when those firms, it's not about destruction because they're finding a clientele for these unsophisticated services that they produce with these more basic technologies. I guess that's fine, but certainly. So I would like to end probably with the idea that it's not just about cost of implementing the technologies, which need to be subsidized by the government, but potentially there is also an heterogeneity in the benefits from using the technologies. And then you should let firms, once they have access to certain access to the technologies, to choose whether they want to implement them or not, and that basically would require different sorts of policies.
Well, it's great to see such detailed results so close to the event as well. Diego, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tim.
So that paper is Technology and Resilience. It's discussion paper 16885 at CEPR. The authors are Javier Serrera, Diego Comín, Marcio Cruz, Kyung-Min Lee, and Jessica Torres. You can download it using the link that's on the screen now. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.